Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Serverless Cast. We're coming to you live from Austin at ServerlessConf. We actually have kind of a quick follow-up here from a session that just happened. Today we've got a great guest, Paul Johnston.
Hello.
And Paul is CTO. Say the company name for me now.
CTO of Movivo.
Movivo. And what we really wanted to do, though, was really kind of break down your talk a little bit. The reason why is because it was probably different from a lot of the others. You had a very different approach and of kind of methodology behind a lot of this that I found very fascinating. So if you don't mind, just kind of give a quick introduction and we'll take it from there.
About the talk or about me?
Both. There you go. Both.
Well, I'm the CTO of a company called Movivo, which is we make mainly Android apps to work with the developing countries and emerging economies and help people to earn free internet. So it's quite social, but there's some money in it. But the talk was really about how a CTO can make a decision for using a serverless framework and infrastructure and idea as a good one over and above the ideas that normally prevail within that conversation.
And to be clear, you didn't decide to like transition to this or shift this. You started the company with a mission of never having a server.
Yeah, that is exactly it.
And you did this 2 years ago?
Just over 18 months ago.
So decently bold.
That's one way of putting it. I've had other people think I'm completely crazy, but it seems to have paid off.
I mean, was this one of these things where like you had this idea that's been floating around in the back of your head, and it was just like, it'd be like one of us saying like, man, if I had a Lamborghini, that would be great, but I don't have $1 million. But if the timing came along, you won the lottery and you had $1 million. I mean, was the timing of serverless coincidental with this idea to start the company, or had you had this idea for a long time and the technology just worked out?
So there's a little bit of a backstory to that, which is that I spent about 7 years prior to becoming CTO of this company as a consultant CTO. Okay. So I'd spent a lot of time with startups, and most of those startups had been companies that were, let's build some kind of mobile app, let's have an API, let's have a back end. So I spent most of the last 7 years building Django or Rails with an API and then something interacting with that API. So when I kind of saw Lambda in 2014, when it was discussed and released, I kind of saw it immediately as, I wish I could just use that behind every single API call. That would have made it a lot easier. Then it's on demand, and I kind of began to see the value back then. So when in 2015 it kind of came along that there was a company that wanted me to work with them, I was like, yeah, let's go for it. Let's have a look. So that's really where it comes from.
And the other thing too, before we dig into the presentation today, is we actually those that follow the show know we actually nicknamed this cast the Jeff Cast.
Oh yes.
So give everyone, for those that aren't in on the joke, give everyone a little bit of the background of serverless and Jeff.
Well, okay. I wrote a blog post sometime early last year, which was saying actually serverless is just a name. We could have called it Jeff. I can tell you why I chose Jeff, which was that we have a joke in our household where if we used to have dogs, and the dogs used to smell a lot, and every time we used to say that they'd smelled, we'd say that they had Jeffed. So that was basically a subtext for when there was a bad smell, someone had Jeffed in the room, and it just seemed like an amusing thing privately for me, but that's kind of, I've never said that in public, so it's a good time to take that out and tell everyone where that came from.
Well done.
Well, and it makes sense, and it was, the whole point of it was just, look, you may not like the name serverless, you can call it Jeff, whatever. It's, dig into what's underneath the covers, and so it was nice because this morning there was one presenter that spent a few minutes on saying, like, let me explain to you what serverless is, because maybe you don't understand it. But then we've moved on from that, so we haven't spent all day going, hashing through definitions, which is nice.
Yeah, absolutely. So about the presentation today, though, and it will be available before too much longer online, so definitely would recommend everyone go take a look. But I wanted to because, yeah, like you were saying, most people kind of either know the definition or at least have an idea of the definition. But then at the same time, the next one under that is, okay, people tend to understand the basic benefits or use cases, some of these. But you actually took a different approach in that you took it from I want to run a company off of this. And so, for instance, I took some notes here. The one was the idea of reduced maintenance over time. That actually, by having something in a VM or something that you have to patch and maintain, that it just becomes stale over time and actually is increased operations.
Yes, and that's just an experience thing. So that's coming from 15 years of running servers, understanding that you need to keep patching, you need to keep doing these things. If that's someone else's responsibility, then your operational expenditure over that time is reduced. It just has to be. It doesn't matter if it takes a little bit longer to develop in the first place. You end up over maybe 3 years, 4 years, getting that value back at the end of the day. And I think most people don't build things and then change them every year, so you don't lose by building something that is going to last a longer time. And also you get scale, you get all of these other things that go along with it, and reduce cost. So I think it makes sense. I think there's an argument that makes sense there.
Yeah. And you're not saying, just so for anybody, people sometimes pick up little sound bites out of it. You're not saying there's no maintenance to serverless. I mean, you're still maintaining, code libraries. You've got to make sure there's not the equivalent of a heartbleed in a Ruby. So, but you're not maintaining the OS anymore, or a physical server or a VM or anything below the function itself.
Yeah, it's. As I say to people, it's not completely removing all the problems, it's just creating different problems that you need to handle. And the difficult ones, the ones that actually everyone can do but they're not very good at, are managing servers. If you've got your provider doing that for you, then that just takes a whole lot of headaches. Certainly for a CTO whose job is looking at the overall cost of things and the running and the maintenance, it makes a big difference.
Yeah. Now, you also mentioned something too, and I'm going to take a guess here and say we've all been in this industry about the same amount of time. And I'm assuming you grew up in the typical 3-tier architectures, right? And you mentioned that another portion of this is wrapping your head around a different way of thinking around architectures, of moving from that 3-tier architecture to an event-based architecture. What exactly did you mean by that?
So when people first play with creating a Lambda function with AWS and and with any of the solutions, what they generally do is go, well, I know Django, or I know Rails, or I know this thing, so I'm going to try and copy that idea into Lambda, into this little small container. And what they end up doing is they build a bulky container that doesn't really do what they want, and it's got a lot of bulk in there. And I think when you start to come back to how Lambda was originally created and how all of the other services have followed on, the event is absolutely core. It's something that happens when something happens. Your Lambda function is a response to a thing happening. If you think about it like a normal monolithic 3-tier application, that's not actually how we do things. We do things by this happens, then this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and it's not actually event driven. In reality,
like transaction driven, maybe is that a better way to think about it? I mean,
I think most people go procedural. I think there's still there's 4 things that need to happen, and I'm going to make a procedure to go through all of them. And even if it's object oriented underneath, they're still thinking procedurally.
Yeah, and that brings to my next point was you had mentioned exactly that a lot of developers still think very procedurally, but they need to start thinking both distributed and asynchronous.
Yes.
And that I kind of like sat back for a second. I'm like, that one I'd never really heard of in a serverless context before. And so tell us a little bit what you meant by that as well.
I think if you go down an event-driven thinking process, you realise that you don't have to have everything in the same place. So you realise that then you can pull a service from any third party in the world ever, it doesn't matter which one it is, on the basis of an event. So you can start to think about distribution, but then you start to think about distribution of data. And one of the problems with Lambda is the infinite scale. You need to have the data scale with it. You can't have a relational database system sitting there that doesn't scale.
Single point of failure.
It becomes your single point of failure. So you have to then start thinking about your data being distributed. So you start thinking, instead of relational, you start going to NoSQL in some form. We use DynamoDB. There are other options out there, but you have to start. You have to start playing with those as an API call, not a
physical box.
Not a physical
instance.
box over there. So all of a sudden, your data calls become service calls, not connections to a box, as you say.
Yeah, I used to do this thing with my kids when we were trying to teach them how to be better writers. The exercise was explain to me how you'd make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
Yeah.
Right. And it was I get peanut butter and I put it on the bread and I go no. Where did you get the peanut butter from? Where was it on the shelf? How did you open the door? So you'd walk through this thing, which I think as I hear more people here talk about, well, this is a step, this was an event. So that all sort of begins to logically make sense, that each one of those becomes a function. And but at some point, then somebody goes, I want to optimize that, right? Like I used to take a class in university where we would optimize manufacturing processes and reduce steps. Do you see that, like in terms of like you said, do I build a bulkier function because it reduces steps? How does that thinking evolve?
How does the thinking evolve? That's quite
or maybe not the thinking, but like, do you see that happening because people say, "Hey, I can jam two things together and then I only maintain one," or something?
So that happens quite a lot actually. When there is a trade-off. You try. My rule of thumb is one thing in each function. Okay. So try and do only one thing. So only one data transformation or only one service call or whatever it is. And so over time, what you find is that other developers have slightly different ideas, and those ideas are different in some way, shape, or form. Sure. And so there are some who do 3 or 4 things in a function. The problems come when you go, well, actually, what about the last 2 steps of that function? What happens if that needs to be done somewhere else? And then you find that, I'll bypass those top bits of the function. And then you kind of go, well, actually, it would be easier if you separated those 2 things out. But you want it asynchronously separated out. So you need to then have some kind of way of creating an event. And so you start putting a lot more events into your system and that is a bit of a struggle. Certainly if you're used to a procedural or even a normal approach. Yeah. It's a bit of a stretch to get there.
Yeah. And kind of a follow-on question to that then is, if you have a developer that's out there and they've kind of grown up in a procedural world, if you will, right? And now we're saying you need to start thinking more distributed. You need to start thinking more asynchronous. Does that mean, okay, so if I connect a whole bunch of dots here for a second, I don't have no operations, but I have reduced operations and I have reduced costs. But now do I have to then get more expensive developers or more specialized developers or developers with a very new skill set? So when it comes to staffing something like this, how would you think about that or go about that?
Well, so my first impression was that we would have to get better developers, and that was kind of the route that I went down. And we're not a massive team, and so I started hired the best people I could find who understood cloud, and they're not cheap. and you kind of go down that route for a while, and then you realise that once you've built these things, because they don't require the same amount of maintenance, that actually you can get quite bored. And so what we ended up doing is actually looking at the kinds of skills you need to be able to think distributed are not necessarily normal developer skills. They're actually more sysadmin skills. So someone with a sysadmin background is more likely to understand the distributed thinking that goes with building an entire system with events within it than necessarily a framework-based developer like a Django or a Rails or a whatever. So we found that. But also, one of the people we've recently hired, who's only been in the company about 6 weeks, he's only got 2 years experience, kind of did vocational training on the job, and he's turned out to be a revelation to me because he hasn't got the background of having the baggage of frameworks and servers and all of those kinds of things, and that baggage does seem to get in the way. So possibly it's better to go down the route of younger, hungrier developers who don't have that experience behind them.
Sure. And I'll close out with kind of this last question of, and we talked about it with the Azure Functions folks on the previous podcast. everyone likes to talk about vendor lock-in, no matter what the technology is, right? And you actually brought it up in your talk as well, but you had a different spin on it in that it isn't about the code per se. It's more about the ecosystem because you no matter what, you're going to need analytics. You're going to need debugging, monitoring, all these other things, and you actually may get more locked in there. And to add to that very quickly as well, the Azure folks also said, well, there's that, but there's also data and the data gravity aspects of moving things as well. So what is your kind of take on all of that?
I can answer that as a CTO, and I think that's probably the easiest way to answer it. You don't want to necessarily have 47 different services that you use. You want to be able to say, I'm using these few services and understand why you're using them. But you do get partially locked in. But then the other thing that becomes more interesting is that you actually have more availability for sending data to third-party services anyway. So you could end up with a logging system over here, and you could end up with an analytics platform over here. So an example from within Movivo, which is interesting, is we have, I think, around 9 or 10 third parties that we send data out to who give us analytics and metrics in various different ways. And we have our internal metrics within AWS. So while we do have vendor lock-in in some senses, we're not necessarily as locked in as it might appear from the outside. It's probably more about skill sets. So developer skill sets are probably going to be based around AWS or Azure or IBM or whatever it is. And it's easier to build one set of skills rather than have to build on 2 or 3 different clouds at a different time. So I take there are various different ways of looking at it.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense, and I think we've for years we've talked to some of the guys over at Netflix, and they'll say the same sort of thing. It's we're building around the skill sets we have, and at some point we pick a stack, and you ride that horse, and you're going to have trade-offs, but like at the end of the day, it becomes hire the best people, build a culture around it, try and put some procedure around it that's repeatable, and that makes sense.
But it's never perfect as well.
No,
I think
absolutely not.
You always end up with trying to make the best of what you've got. And you will make mistakes. And one of the advantages, I think, of having a serverless approach and a distributed approach is I think it's easier probably to make that change.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
good. Fantastic. Well, we'll go ahead and close this out. So, Paul, where can everyone, we know you're both pretty prolific on Medium as well as Twitter, so where can everyone find you and kind of learn more?
It's the best place, Twitter and Medium, and it's at Paul D. Johnston.
All right, fantastic. And we'll have links to in the show notes as well. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to everyone soon.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.